The sound was small at first, almost lost beneath the crackle of the fire and the groan of the storm outside. A soft shuffle, then a faint cough. Annabelle turned her head toward the hallway. A moment later, a little girl appeared. She couldn't have been more than 6, her hair a tumble of dark curls that caught the firelight. She wore a faded nightgown, the hem dragging across the wooden floor, and clutched a threadbare doll to her chest. Her eyes, clear and wide, the same slate gray as her father's, studied Annabelle with the same cautious weight Colt had shown. The child blinked once, then twice. Finally, she whispered, "Papa, is she the one?" Colt's shoulders stiffened. His jaw worked, but no words came. Annabelle felt her own throat tighten, though she wasn't sure why. The little girl stepped closer, still clutching her doll. Her voice trembled but carried a strange certainty. "Papa, God finally sent her to us." The silence that followed felt endless. The fire popped. Wind rattled the shutters. Annabelle swallowed hard, her heart knocking against her ribs. She hadn't expected this, hadn't asked for it. And yet, something in the child's words sank into her bones like a promise too heavy to ignore. Colt bent down slightly, his voice low and rough. "Maddie, back to bed." But the girl shook her head. "No, Papa. She's the one. Mama said God would send someone when the time was right." Her small fingers clutched Annabelle's skirt before Colt could pull her away. Annabelle froze. The warmth of that tiny hand was both comforting and terrifying. She wanted to kneel, to explain, to tell this child she was only here by mistake. But the look in Maddie's eyes, hopeful, fragile, certain, robbed her of words. Colt straightened slowly, a storm of emotions flickering across his face. Anger, grief, disbelief, and something else he quickly buried. "Enough," he said, sharper this time. He scooped Maddie into his arms, though she wriggled in protest. "It's late. You'll catch cold." As he carried her down the hallway, her small voice drifted back, soft but stubborn. "She's the one, Papa. You'll see." Annabelle stood frozen near the fire, her shawl still wrapped tight around her shoulders. She hadn't come here to belong. She hadn't come to replace a wife, to mother a child, or to heal a broken man. And yet, in that moment, with the storm raging outside and the child's words echoing in her ears, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she had been sent here for more than survival. Annabelle stood by the fire for a long time after Colt disappeared down the hallway with his daughter. The warmth licked at her chilled skin, but inside she still felt frozen. The girl's words clung to her, like burrs caught in wool, impossible to brush away. She finally lowered herself into one of the rough-hewn chairs near the hearth. Her fingers, stiff from the cold, fumbled with the ties of her shawl. She wanted to rest, but her mind would not quiet. The wrong ranch, she thought bitterly. Of all the places in Montana, why here? The floor creaked behind her. Colt had returned. His heavy boots crossed the room, steady, measured, as if every step had been thought through before he took it. He didn't sit. Instead, he leaned against the mantel, arms crossed, eyes hard as stone. "She's been through enough," he said at last, his voice low. "She doesn't need false hope." Annabelle looked up at him, her own voice quiet but steady. "Children don't hope falsely, Mr. Rafferty. They see what's missing long before adults admit it." For a flicker of a second, his jaw softened. Then it set like granite again. "You'll sleep here tonight. Tomorrow I'll take you to Fort Banner, and the agency can fix their mistake." She wanted to argue, wanted to ask if he truly believed mistakes were so easy to fix, but exhaustion weighed her down. So she only nodded and rose to gather her small trunk. Colt gestured down the hall. "Spare rooms on the left." Annabelle stepped into the narrow hallway, her boots thudding softly against the worn wood. She caught sight of the girl's door, just barely cracked open. A pair of wide gray eyes peeked out, watching her. Annabelle gave the faintest smile. Maddie's little lips curved in return before the door clicked shut. The spare room was simple. A narrow bed, a quilt patched so many times it looked more like a memory than a blanket. Annabelle lowered herself onto it, not bothering to undress, and listened to the wind batter the house. For a long time, She lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying Maddie's words. God finally sent you to us. Meanwhile, Colt sat by the dying fire, his elbows braced on his knees. He rubbed the worn wedding band still circling his finger, his thumb tracing the grooves like a prayer. He could still hear his wife's voice sometimes, softer than the wind, telling him not to harden his heart completely. But hardening was the only thing that had kept him standing. Now, with a stranger asleep in his home and his daughter whispering about God's promises, that armor felt weaker than it had in years. He hated it. And yet, a part of him wondered if Maddie wasn't wrong. Morning came sharp and cold. Pale light spilled across the snow-covered hills, painting the world in silver. Annabelle woke to the sound of clattering in the kitchen. When she stepped out of the room, she found Maddie perched on a stool, feet swinging, while Colt set a tin plate of biscuits on the table. The girl's face lit up the moment she saw Annabelle. "Good morning," she chirped, as if they'd been family forever. Colt shot her a look, but Annabelle only smiled. "Good morning," she said gently. "Sit," Colt muttered. "Eat before we head out." Annabelle sat across from Maddie. The biscuits were rough but warm, the kind of food that reminded her how long it had been since she'd known real comfort. Maddie leaned forward, eyes bright. "Papa says you're leaving today," she said, voice soft with disappointment. "But you don't have to. You could stay." Colt dropped a fork onto the table harder than he meant to. "Maddie." Annabelle swallowed, her throat tight. She reached across the table and touched the girl's hand. "Sometimes God's plans aren't clear right away," she said softly. "But he always knows what he's doing." Colt stood, chair scraping against the floor. "Enough talk. We ride for Fort Banner after breakfast." But even as he turned away, his fists clenched at his sides, he knew this wasn't going to be so simple. The storm outside had only just begun, and not just the one in the snow. By the time the dishes were cleared, the sky outside had shifted. What had begun as soft morning snow had thickened into a curtain of white, swallowing the land whole. Colt opened the door and stood in the threshold, his broad frame outlined against the swirl of the storm. The cold wind rushed in, biting at Annabelle's face. He didn't move for a long while, just stared into the storm. Then, with a sharp breath through his nose, he closed the door again. "We're not going anywhere today," he said, his voice edged with frustration. Maddie clapped her hands, delighted. "See, Papa? God wants her to stay." Colt turned and gave her a look that could have stopped a grown man cold, but Maddie only grinned wider. Annabelle felt a smile tugging at her own lips, though she quickly hid it behind the rim of her cup. "I'll make myself useful," Annabelle said quietly. "If I'm to stay, even for a day, I won't sit idle." Colt gave her a long, measured look. "We don't need charity." Annabelle straightened her shoulders. "It's not charity. It's what I know how to do. I can cook, sew, mend, whatever you'll allow." Something flickered in his eyes, but it was gone before she could name it. He gave a curt nod and left her standing in the kitchen. That afternoon, Annabelle found her way around the small ranch house. The place carried the weight of silence. Rooms clean but untouched, shelves holding dust where laughter should have been. In the parlor, she spotted the child's wooden horse again and gently picked it up, brushing away the cobweb clinging to its tail. Maddie patted in, dragging a faded quilt, and her eyes lit up. "That was mine when I was little," she said proudly. Annabelle smiled and crouched beside her. "You're still little." Maddie shook her head firmly. "Not too little to help Papa. I carry wood. I feed the chickens when it's not too cold. He says I'm his best ranch hand." Annabelle chuckled softly. "I believe it." The girl studied her, her gray eyes too wise for her years. "You make the house feel different. Not so empty." Before Annabelle could reply, Colt's voice called from outside, rough as gravel. "Maddie, get your boots. I need help with the stock before the storm worsens." Maddie scampered off. Annabelle stood there for a moment, the weight of the little girl's words pressing against her chest. Not so empty. By nightfall, the wind howled like wolves against the shutters. Colt came in last, snow clinging to his shoulders, his hands red with cold. He said nothing as Annabelle set down a pot of stew she had made from what little she found in the pantry. The rich smell filled the room, and for the first time that day, the tight lines around Colt's mouth eased. They ate in silence, save for Maddie's chatter. She told stories about her pony, about the time she tried to bake biscuits and nearly burned the barn, about how her papa always pretended not to smile but sometimes she caught him. Colt gave her a stern look, but Annabelle caught the faintest twitch at the corner of his lips. After the meal, when Maddie was tucked into bed, Annabelle sat by the fire with her sewing kit, mending a tear in her glove. Colt lowered himself into the chair across from her, the weight of the day heavy on his shoulders. "You shouldn't get too comfortable here," he said gruffly. "As soon as the road's clear, you'll be on the next stage to Fort Banner." Annabelle didn't look up from her stitches. "I never planned to be here, Mr. Rafferty, but life doesn't always ask permission." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then, to her surprise, Colt said quietly, "You remind me of her." Her needle paused mid-stitch. She lifted her eyes to him, but he was staring into the flames, jaw tight, voice low. "My wife. Strong. Too strong for this land, maybe, but she never stopped fighting it. You have that same fire." Annabelle's throat tightened. She did not speak, afraid that any word might break the fragile thread he had just let slip. And for the first time since she arrived, the silence between them didn't feel like a wall. It felt like the beginning of something unspoken. Colt's jaw tightened, the muscle flickering beneath his stubble. He did not answer at first. The firelight crackled, throwing shadows against the wall like restless ghosts. At last, he drew a breath through his teeth, steady but sharp. "I don't know," he said. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the flames. "That's the truth. I don't know." Annabelle stayed still, watching him carefully. "There are nights I think I must have," he continued. His eyes were far away now, staring through the floorboards, through time itself. "The drink, the anger, the way she looked at me that week, like she was already halfway gone. Maybe I pushed her without even laying a hand." His hands flexed against his knees, hard as iron. "And then," he added, his voice cracking for the first time, "there are nights I swear I hear her calling from the woods, like she never left at all." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke. Annabelle's heart ached, not only for him but for Emmy, for the little girl who had lived in that silence, who had lost a mother and gained questions no child should ever carry. Finally, Annabelle spoke, her words gentle, steady, but strong. "You loved her." Colt's eyes lifted to hers, sharp and pained. "Love doesn't change the fact she's gone." "No," Annabelle said, "but it changes what you carry." For a long moment they only looked at each other, two people bound by loss, by guilt, by the ache of roads they could never walk back down. Then, a small sound broke the air. Soft footsteps. Both their heads turned. At the edge of the doorway, Emmy stood barefoot again, her rag doll clutched to her chest. She looked smaller than ever, a shadow framed by the glow of the fire. Her lips trembled as she stared at her father, then at Annabelle. Annabelle rose slowly and crossed the room, kneeling so her eyes were level with the girl's. "It's all right, sweetheart," she whispered. Emmy shook her head, eyes wide with some terror she could not put into words. And then, in a voice so faint it was almost lost to the crackle of the flames, she said, "Pa didn't do it." Colt went rigid. Annabelle drew in a sharp breath, steadying Emmy with gentle hands on her arms. "What do you mean, darling?" Emmy's eyes filled with tears, but she forced the words out, broken and halting. "It wasn't Pa. The man, the shadow. He took Mama. Pa was asleep." Colt's face drained of color. His breath came shallow, ragged. "Emmy," he whispered, almost afraid to believe. But the child nodded fiercely now, her small fists gripping Annabelle's shawl like lifelines. "He didn't hurt her. He didn't. A bad man came. I saw." Annabelle wrapped her arms around the trembling child, holding her close. Her own pulse raced with the weight of what she had just heard. She turned her gaze to Colt, and for the first time, she saw him not as a man hardened by silence, not as a figure cloaked in guilt, but as a father wrongly bound to a ghost of blame. Colt's hands shook as he lowered himself into a chair, staring at his daughter as though seeing her for the first time in years. Tears rimmed his eyes, but they did not fall. He whispered, hoarse, "Then I've been hating myself for nothing." Annabelle, her cheek pressed to Emmy's hair, met his gaze over the child's shoulder. Her voice was quiet but firm. "No," she said, "you've been hating yourself because you thought you deserved it. But this family has been bleeding in silence long enough. The truth changes everything." The wind howled outside, but inside the room, something else stirred. A shift, fragile as glass, but real. Colt pressed a hand to his mouth. His shoulders bowed as though the truth itself weighed more than his body could carry. His chest rose and fell like he had been running for miles, though he hadn't moved an inch. For years, every night he had sat by that fire and stared into the flames, believing himself a killer without ever pulling a trigger. And now, his daughter's trembling words cracked the coffin of silence he had nailed around himself. Emmy sniffled, hiding her face in Annabelle's shawl. Annabelle smoothed the girl's hair, whispering soft sounds meant to calm. Her eyes never left Colt's, though, because she could feel it, the shift inside him. Finally, Colt lowered his hand. His voice was rough, almost broken. She saw it. She saw the man? His eyes darted to his daughter, afraid of pushing too hard, afraid of shattering what little courage Emmy had gathered. Annabelle gave a gentle nod. She saw enough to know the truth, enough to know you didn't fail her. Emmy's small voice wavered from the safety of Annabelle's arms. He wore a hat. His face was dark. Mama screamed, but he took her fast. Her tiny fists curled tighter in Annabelle's shawl. "I told Pa once, but he didn't hear me. He never heard me." The words struck Colt like a blow. His hand gripped the arm of his chair until the wood groaned. His eyes glistened, but his voice was fierce when it came. "I hear you now, Emmy. I swear it. I hear you." For the first time since she had stepped through that door, Annabelle felt the room warm beyond the fire. It wasn't comfort, not yet, but it was something harder, rarer, the start of truth. The kind that breaks chains. Emmy pulled back enough to look at her father, her cheeks streaked with tears. She whispered, "Don't be sad anymore, Pa." Colt's throat worked, but no words came. Instead, he opened his arms. Slow, hesitant, as if he feared she might turn away. Emmy froze, torn between the memory of cold distance and the hope of something she thought had been gone forever. Annabelle brushed her hair back. "Go to him," she whispered softly. And Emmy did. She padded across the wooden floor, the hem of her nightdress brushing her ankles, and climbed into her father's lap. Colt wrapped his arms around her, pressing his face into her tangled hair. His shoulders trembled, silent sobs shaking a man who had held back grief for far too long. Annabelle turned her face, giving them privacy, but her own eyes stung. She had seen men break before, but never like this, not in a way that looked like healing instead of ruin. The clock on the mantel ticked slow and steady. Outside, the storm beat against the walls, fierce and unrelenting. Inside, for the first time, Colt Rafferty held his daughter as though nothing else in the world mattered. But the peace was fragile, because somewhere out in the dark, across the snow-choked plains, a man with a shadowed face still lived in Emmy's memory, and perhaps in truth. Annabelle felt it, deep in her bones. The story was not finished, and neither was the danger. The fire burned lower, but no one dared move. Colt still held Emmy in his arms, rocking her as though she were smaller than she really was. His large hand smoothed her hair, again and again, as if the simple motion could undo years of silence. Annabelle sat quietly across from them, the crackle of the flames painting her face in amber light. She could feel something rising inside her. A strange, tender ache. This was not her family. This was not her home. Yet, in this cabin surrounded by snow and sorrow, she felt more belonging than she had ever felt in her own father's house, or in the Missouri agency office that had promised her a new life. Colt lifted his head, his gray eyes finding hers. For once, there was no coldness in them, only raw honesty. I thought if I never spoke her name, if I never asked questions, maybe it wouldn't hurt so much. But all I did was leave my little girl to carry the weight alone. His jaw tightened, shame heavy in his voice. I failed her. Annabelle shook her head, her voice calm but steady. No, you're holding her now. You're listening now. That's not failure, that's the beginning of something new. Children don't remember every word, but they remember who stayed and who left. And you, Colt Rafferty, never left. Emmy curled closer into him, her small hand resting against his chest. Don't send her away, Pa, she whispered, her eyes flicking toward Annabelle. She makes the bad dreams stop. Colt's breath caught. He looked at Annabelle again, longer this time, like he was trying to see past her name and her mistakes and into the truth of who she was. Annabelle held his gaze without flinching. She wanted to tell him that she hadn't come here to save anyone, that she herself had been lost. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply said, "Sometimes God sends us to the wrong door, Colt, but maybe it's the right one after all." The silence that followed was not heavy like before. It was softer, thoughtful, almost alive. But outside, beyond the glow of the windows, something moved. The snow had slowed, but the wind carried with it a sound. A faint crunch of boots pressing into frozen ground. A dark figure lingered at the edge of the tree line, just far enough to be hidden in shadow. His hat brim was low, his coat pulled close, and in his hand gleamed the faintest reflection of steel. The stranger paused, his breath clouding in the bitter air. His eyes were fixed on the ranch house, on the windows glowing with firelight. Then, like a wolf circling its prey, he melted back into the darkness. Inside, Annabelle shivered, though no draft touched her. Something told her this place was no longer just a refuge. It was a target. Annabelle's scream split the cabin as Danner's knife slashed downward. She twisted, throwing herself across Emmy's small frame, taking the steel into her own side. The shock stole her breath, a hot burst of pain flooding through her ribs. Blood blossomed against her dress like fire spreading through dry grass. Emmy shrieked, scrambling backward beneath the table, her tiny hands clutching the doll she had dropped. Danner's shadow loomed over them both, his grin cruel, his knife raised for another strike. And then, Annabelle! Colt's roar thundered through the doorway. The crack of his rifle shattered the air. Danner staggered, his knife slipping from his hand. He clutched at his side, blood soaking through his coat, but he didn't fall. His eyes burned with rage, and he turned toward Colt like a cornered wolf. "You should have stayed drunk, Rafferty," he spat, voice broken but vicious. "Would have saved us all the trouble." Colt stepped forward, shoulders squared, face carved with fury. Snow swirled in through the open door, carried by the storm outside, but his presence filled the room with a heat Annabelle had never seen in him before. "You touched what's mine," Colt said, his voice low, trembling with wrath. "You don't walk out of here alive." Danner lunged. The rifle roared again. The bullet struck true, and this time Danner dropped to his knees, breath rattling like broken glass. His knife clattered to the floor, spinning once before going still. Annabelle lay gasping, her hands pressed desperately against her wound. The world tilted in and out of focus. She heard Emmy crying, felt the child's tiny hands tugging at her sleeve, and then Colt was there, dropping beside her. His rough hands, always so steady with rope and horseflesh, shook violently as they pressed against hers, trying to stem the blood. "Stay with me," he begged, his voice cracking in a way Annabelle had never heard. "Don't you leave me now, not after everything." Her lips trembled, a thin smile breaking through the pain. "I told you. You still had more to give." Tears filled Colt's eyes. He pulled her closer, holding her against his chest as though he could keep her life inside by sheer force of will. Behind him, Danner's body slumped sideways, still at last. The storm outside wailed, shaking the cabin walls, but inside, the only sound was Emmy's sobbing and Colt's broken whisper. "You're not dying here. Not like this. Not in my arms." Annabelle closed her eyes briefly, letting herself rest against him, the warmth of his heartbeat steady under her cheek. She had stepped into this cabin as a stranger, but now, bleeding in his arms, she realized something undeniable. She had found her place. And Colt Rafferty, haunted, broken, drowning in his past, realized something too. He was not as lost as he thought, because Annabelle had chosen to bleed for them, and for the first time in years, he chose to live for her. The storm raged until dawn, clawing at the cabin like a living thing. Snow pressed against the windows, howling through the cracks, but inside, silence grew heavy over the blood-stained floor. Danner's body lay crumpled near the hearth, his lifeless eyes staring at the rafters. The fire hissed and snapped, casting shadows over his face until it looked like nothing more than another broken thing abandoned by the frontier. Colt dragged him aside, jaw set, hands steady again now that the killing was done. But when he turned back, his strength faltered. Annabelle lay pale against the quilt he'd pulled from his own bed, her breath shallow, her lips tinged with gray. Emmy sat curled at her side, her small body trembling, refusing to move even when Colt tried to coax her away. "She's bleeding bad," Emmy whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't let her die, Pa. Please." The word cut Colt deeper than any knife. Pa. She hadn't called him that since the night he buried her mother. He froze, then reached down and brushed a strand of hair from her tear-streaked cheek. "She won't die," he said, though fear hollowed the promise. "Not if I've got anything left to give." He tore strips from a sheet, pressing them firmly against Annabelle's wound. His big hands, always used to rope, rifle, and hammer, worked clumsily but desperate. Annabelle flinched, gasped, then forced her eyes open. "You fight like hell," Colt ordered softly. "Don't you dare give up on me now." Her lips curved faintly, even through the pain. "Bossy," she whispered. "You're a stubborn man, Colt Rafferty." He bowed his head over her, his breath shaking. "And you're a stubborn woman. That's why you're gonna live." Hours bled away with the storm. Colt never left her side, not even to drink or rest. Emmy dozed against Annabelle's arm, her little body refusing to let go. Whenever Annabelle stirred, whenever her eyes fluttered open, Colt was there, his calloused hand gripping hers, his voice low, steady, anchoring her back to life. By the time the storm broke, a weak winter sun spilled pale light through the frost-streaked glass. The world outside lay buried in white silence, but inside, the fire still burned, and so did Annabelle. Her color had returned, faint but present, her breath steadier, stronger. Colt exhaled for the first time in hours. He leaned back, exhaustion carving deep lines into his face, and pressed a hand to his eyes. For the first time since his wife's death, he let the tears fall. Not for grief this time, but for relief. When he looked up again, Annabelle's gaze was fixed on him. Her smile was faint but alive. "You stayed," she whispered. Colt swallowed hard. "I'll always stay." Emmy stirred, blinking sleepily, then nestled closer against Annabelle. She looked up at her father and, in a voice trembling with both fear and relief, said, "Can we keep her, Pa? Please." Colt's throat closed. He glanced at Annabelle, pale but fierce, her hand clutching Emmy's like it belonged there. For the first time, the cabin didn't feel empty, felt like home again. He nodded slowly, voice breaking as he answered, "She's already ours." Upstairs, Emmy stirred from her nap, the faint creak of the rafters above reminding Annabelle of the little life that had wrapped around her so completely. Her hands faltered on the trunk clasp. She closed her eyes, pressing her palm to her bandaged ribs as if the ache inside could be silenced. The floorboards groaned behind her. Colt stood in the doorway, his shoulders filling the frame, his face unreadable in the gray morning light. In his hand, he held the letter she had left on the mantel. His voice was low, ragged. "You thought you could just write this and slip away?" Annabelle's heart lurched. "Colt." "No," his voice cracked, harsher than he meant. He lifted the letter, shaking it slightly. "You think Emmy and I need more than you? That you leaving us is some kind of kindness? Annabelle, don't you see? You are the future I prayed for." Her breath caught. The confession broke through the walls she'd built around herself. Still, she forced herself to meet his eyes. "I can't give you children, Colt. You deserve a wife who can." He stepped closer, every word sharp with conviction. "I buried the woman who gave me a child. And I would have buried myself if you hadn't come walking through that door. Do you hear me? Emmy doesn't need a mother who can give her a brother or sister. She needs you, the woman who held her through her nightmares, the woman who nearly died to keep her safe. That's worth more than blood. That's worth everything." Tears burned her eyes. "You don't mean that." "I've never meant anything more." For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the old clock and the hush of wind pressing against the walls. Then, soft footsteps padded down the stairs. Emmy appeared, hair rumpled, eyes wide and sleepy. She rubbed her fists against her face before crawling onto Annabelle's lap without a word. The little girl laid her head against her chest, as if she'd always belonged there. Colt's voice broke into a whisper. "Annabelle, don't take her mama away again." Annabelle clutched Emmy tightly, her tears spilling into the girl's hair. The letter slipped from Colt's hand, drifting to the floor, forgotten. And for the first time, Annabelle didn't feel like an outsider trying to fit into a life that wasn't hers. She felt like home. The days that followed moved slow, as though winter itself held its breath. Annabelle grew stronger, though the scar along her ribs still pulled when she bent or lifted. She busied herself with small tasks, mending Colt's shirts by the fire, baking bread in the kitchen with Emmy pressed at her side, humming as flour dusted the girl's nose. It was the quiet rhythm of a life she'd never thought she would have. But beyond the cabin walls, the world whispered. When Annabelle finally ventured into Fort Banner with Colt and Emmy, the stairs cut colder than the wind. Women glanced at her with narrowed eyes, their whispers sharp. Men lingered a little too long in their looks, their curiosity not always kind. Everyone in town had heard of the widow Colt Rafferty, the rancher who had lost his wife and daughter in one brutal night. And now here he was, standing tall with another woman at his side. One who had arrived not by choice, but by accident. By mistake. Annabelle felt the judgment pressing down on her shoulders as they walked through the mercantile. Emmy clung tightly to her skirt, sensing her unease. Colt noticed too. His jaw tightened, his broad frame shifting closer to shield them both. When the whispers grew louder near the counter, Annabelle ducked her head. But Colt did not. His voice, low and steady, carried through the room. "This woman," he said, resting his hand firmly on Annabelle's shoulder, "stood between my daughter and a killer. She bled for us. If anyone here's got a word against her, you can say it to me." Silence. The storekeeper cleared his throat and busied himself with weighing flour. A mother tugged her child closer. No one spoke. Annabelle felt the heat rise in her cheeks. But for the first time, the shame was not her burden alone. Colt had carried it too openly without apology. That night, back at the ranch, as snow fell thick and heavy outside, Annabelle sat at the fire with Emmy tucked against her side. Colt was at the table, polishing his revolver, but his gaze drifted to them often, soft in a way Annabelle was still not used to seeing. Emmy lifted her face, eyes bright. "Mama, will you sing me the lullaby again?" Annabelle's throat tightened. The word mama had come so easily now, as natural as breath. She began to sing, her voice low and trembling at first, then steady, carrying warmth into the shadows of the room. When Emmy finally drifted to sleep, Colt set his revolver aside and crossed the room. He stood before Annabelle, the firelight flickering across his face, making him look younger, less burdened. "You're not leaving," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Her eyes glistened. She shook her head. "No, Colt, I'm not leaving." He bent, brushed a hand across her cheek, and pressed his forehead to hers. For the first time since Eleanor's death, since the long years of silence and grief, Colt Rafferty allowed himself to breathe without pain. Outside, the storm howled. But inside that cabin, a new kind of vow had been made, wordless, fragile, but real. A family, not born of blood, but bound by something fiercer, choice. By the time the first hints of spring reached the Montana territory, the Rafferty Ranch had changed. The snowdrifts began to recede, revealing stubborn shoots of grass pushing through the thaw. Ice cracked and slipped from the eaves of the house, dripping into the soft mud below. The air, though still sharp, carried a different scent, promise instead of despair. Inside, the cabin had changed too. The laughter of a child now threaded through its beams. Where once silence had ruled, there were now half-finished drawings pinned to the wall, a little doll resting on the mantel beside Eleanor's portrait, and the faint trace of baking bread lingering in the air. Annabelle had taken to rising early, before the sun crested the hills. She would stir the fire, knead dough, and hum quietly as the house warmed. Sometimes she would step outside onto the porch, shawl drawn tight, and watch Colt in the distance, shoulders squared as he worked the fence line. His figure moved steady and sure against the awakening land, and every time, something in her chest ached. She still remembered the letter she had written, her farewell, her confession that she could not give him more children. She had never given it to him. The paper remained folded, tucked into her trunk. Yet every morning when Emmy's arms wrapped around her waist, when Colt's gaze lingered a heartbeat too long at supper, the words on that page seemed less true. One evening, after a long day mending tack and chasing Emmy's laughter across the yard, Colt stepped inside with dirt on his boots and weariness in his bones. But when his eyes fell on Annabelle, seated at the table braiding Emmy's hair, something eased. "Looks like spring finally decided to come," he said, his voice low. Annabelle looked up, her lips curving softly. "I wasn't sure it ever would." Their eyes met. There was no rush in the glance, no desperate need, just a quiet recognition. Winter had passed. That night, when Emmy was asleep beneath her quilt, Colt found Annabelle standing at the window. She gazed out over the land, where moonlight silvered the fields and the air smelled faintly of thawing earth. "You've made this place a home again," Colt said from behind her. She turned, startled. His face was solemn, shadowed with memory, but his eyes were clear. "Colt," she began, but he stepped closer. "I thought I buried my heart with Eleanor. I thought Emmy would grow up never knowing a mother's touch. But then you came, even if it was by mistake." He gave a rough laugh, almost bitter, but his hand trembled as it reached for hers. "Maybe God knew better than I did." Annabelle's throat closed. She wanted to protest, to remind him of the truth she still carried, that she could not give him more children, that she was not whole. But when his calloused hand folded gently over hers, she could not speak. "Annabelle," he said softly, "I don't want you here for one season. I want you here for all of them. Will you stay?" Her heart thundered, louder than the storm winds of winter had ever been. Tears burned her eyes as she whispered, "Yes." Colt bent, his forehead resting against hers, and for a moment the cabin seemed to exhale. Outside, the thawing earth stirred with life. Inside, a vow was sealed, not with ceremony or rings, but with truth spoken in the quiet from the loft above. A small voice broke the silence. "I knew it," Emmy whispered sleepily, her smile audible even in the dark. Annabelle laughed, breathless, and Colt drew her against him, finally allowing hope to settle into his bones. The Montana winter had taken much from them, but the spring had given them back a family. By June, the Montana territory had shed its last traces of winter. The meadows rippled with wildflowers, purple lupin and golden sunbursts bending in the wind. The river ran high with meltwater, swift and strong, carving its way through the valley. On the ranch, Long days began before dawn and ended only when the stars swept across the sky. Annabel had learned the rhythms of the land. Her hands, once delicate from a life of sewing and genteel chores, now bore calluses from milking, scrubbing, and hauling water. She moved with quiet determination, and though the work wore her thin, it also gave her a strength she had never known. Emmy clung to her like a shadow. In the fields she skipped alongside Annabel, carrying a basket of eggs too big for her little arms. At night she nestled close as Annabel read aloud from a worn Bible, her small voice joining in when the words grew familiar. One evening, as the heat of the day softened into the cool of twilight, Colt returned from driving cattle. Dust clung to his shirt and hat, and his shoulders sagged with exhaustion. Yet when he stepped onto the porch and saw Annabel sitting with Emmy curled against her lap, his weariness seemed to fall away. "You've tamed her better than I ever could," he teased, setting his hat aside. Annabel smiled softly. "Children don't need taming. They need roots, and someone to notice when they bloom." The words caught him off guard. For the first time in years, Colt let himself imagine more than survival. He imagined joy, but summer brought more than sunlight. At the edge of the valley, neighbors had begun to talk. Some said Colt Rafferty was a fool for bringing in a mail-order bride. Others whispered crueler things, that Annabel had chased a dead woman's place, that she was barren and would never give Colt a true heir. Annabel heard the whispers at Sunday service in Fort Banner. Though the congregation greeted her politely, she caught the sideways glances, the murmurs. Emmy clutched her hand tighter, sensing the unease. That night, as they drove the wagon home beneath a sky lit with stars, Annabel sat stiffly beside Colt. He noticed the tension in her silence. "They don't matter," Colt said gruffly, guiding the reins. "They do," Annabel whispered, her throat tight. "Because some of what they say is true." Colt frowned. "Annabel, I can't give you children," she said quickly, the confession she had buried spilling out into the night air. "You deserve a legacy, Colt. Someone to carry your name. Cannot give you that. And the town will never let me forget it." The horses plodded forward, the only sound for a long while. Then Colt's hand left the reins and found hers. His grip was strong, unyielding. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low but fierce. "I buried one woman I loved. I will not bury another because of lies. You've given Emmy back her laughter. You've given me back my life. That's more than legacy. It's salvation." Annabel's eyes burned. She turned her face away, but his hand stayed, anchoring her. When they reached the ranch, Emmy was asleep, her small head resting on Annabel's shoulder. Colt lifted the girl gently, carrying her inside. When he returned to the porch, the moonlight silvered his face. He knelt before Annabel, his pride cast aside. "I don't care what the town says. I don't care what you think you cannot give. Annabel Sinclair. Stay here, as my wife, in name and in truth." Her breath caught. No grand ceremony, no audience. Just the man she had come to love, asking with nothing but honesty. Tears spilled hot down her cheeks. "Yes, Colt?" she whispered, voice trembling. "Yes." The summer wind swept through the fields, carrying the promise of a harvest. And on that ranch, beneath the stars, a family was sown. Not by chance, but by choice. The weeks after the wedding rolled by with a kind of peace Colt had not known in years. The ranch, once echoing only with silence and ghosts, now carried the sound of laughter, the scrape of little boots across the floor, the murmur of a woman's voice humming while she worked. Emmy bloomed like spring grass after a hard frost. She followed Annabel everywhere, asking questions, learning how to knead bread, how to sew crooked stitches, how to braid her doll's hair. And Annabel, though she had once believed herself broken, found her hands steady, her voice gentle, her heart wide enough to carry the weight of a child's trust. Sometimes, though, in the quiet of night, shadows crept in. Annabel would wake trembling, haunted by Danner's face, by the knife flashing in the lamplight, by the taste of blood in her mouth. Colt, half asleep, would pull her against his chest, grounding her with his warmth. He said little, He was not a man of many words, but the way he held her spoke enough. "You're safe now. You're not alone. Not ever again." One evening, as the spring thaw began and the river swelled with melted snow, Annabelle found herself walking the fence line with Colt. The land stretched wide around them, mountains still capped with white, sky painted gold with setting sun. "You ever think it's too much?" she asked suddenly. Colt glanced at her, puzzled. "What is all this?" She swept her hand toward the ranch, toward the hills, toward the house where Emmy's laughter carried faintly through the open window. "Being trusted with more than you think you deserve." Colt stopped, resting his hand on the weathered post. "Every day." She turned to him. "So what do you do with it?" His eyes softened. "You wake up, you work hard, you love em the best you can, and you thank God they gave you the chance." Her throat tightened. She leaned against him, breathing in the smell of leather and hay and the man who had become her anchor. "Sometimes I still feel like I don't belong here," she admitted quietly. Colt tilted her chin until her eyes met his. "Annabelle Sinclair," he said, voice low and steady. "You belong here more than anyone I've ever known. And Emmy knows it too. She doesn't call you Mama because she's pretending. She calls you that because you are." Her chest swelled, tears stinging her eyes. For so long she had thought she was nothing but a wanderer, a woman too marked by loss to plant roots. Yet here, in the rough hands of a rancher and the fragile arms of a little girl, she had found the soil strong enough to hold her. Months passed. Seasons turned. Emmy's voice grew steadier, brighter, carrying across the yard as she called for her pony or sang the songs Annabelle taught her. The nightmares came less often, though Annabelle still bore scars, some visible, some not. But each time the shadows threatened, she remembered the snow, the letter left behind, the child they had almost lost, and she held on tighter. On the first anniversary of their wedding, the townsfolk gathered at the church again, not for vows this time, but for a celebration. Music filled the hall, boots tapped against wooden floors, and laughter rose like a hymn. Emmy twirled in her blue dress, ribbons flying, while Annabelle clapped along. Colt stood in the corner, arms folded, smiling in that quiet way of his, like a man who had finally laid down every burden as the night drew on. Annabelle found herself standing in the doorway, watching the lantern light spill across the street. She thought of the woman she had been, the one who nearly walked away, who believed love was something she wasn't worthy of. And she thought of the woman she was now, wife, mother, survivor. She whispered into the night, almost to herself, "I stayed, and staying saved me." Behind her, Colt slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her close. Emmy darted toward them, cheeks flushed, her laughter echoing down the street. And in that moment, with the past finally at rest and the future wide open before them, Annabelle knew the truth she had once been too afraid to believe. Family isn't born. It's made through fire, through loss, through forgiveness. And sometimes, if you're lucky, through love strong enough to carry you home. Seasons passed, and life on the Montana frontier settled into a rhythm that felt both fragile and unshakable. The ranch no longer echoed with loneliness but with laughter, with small footsteps racing across wooden floors, with Annabelle's soft voice teaching Emmy how to read by lamplight. Colt worked the land with a steadiness that had returned to him, no longer the hollow man who once haunted his own home. Each evening, when he saw Annabelle and Emmy waiting on the porch, Annabelle's hand resting gently on Emmy's shoulder, he felt something deeper than peace. He felt chosen. But frontier life was never gentle for long. Winter returned early that year, heavy snows cutting them off from town for weeks at a time. The cattle needed constant care, fences collapsed beneath drifts, and every trip to the river for water carried the risk of frostbite. Yet in that harshness, something unspoken grew between them. Annabelle no longer doubted her place. She was not Eleanor's shadow, nor a stand-in. She was Annabelle Sinclair, a woman who had survived war, loss, and silence, and still dared to build something new. One night, as the wind rattled the shutters and the fire snapped in protest against the cold, Emmy crawled into bed between them, clutching her doll as always. Half asleep, She murmured a word that neither Colt nor Annabelle expected. Home. The sound was soft, but it broke them open. Annabelle pressed her lips against Emmy's hair, tears slipping down her cheek. Colt wrapped his arm around them both, holding tighter than he ever had before. For so long, all three of them had been searching for belonging, for safety, for love. And somehow, against the odds of grief and winter, they had found it in each other. In the months that followed, the ranch became more than just land. It became a sanctuary. Neighbors stopped by not just to lend a hand but to linger, drawn to the warmth that seemed to radiate from the Sinclair ranch. Emmy laughed more, spoke more, and even sang when she thought no one was listening. Annabelle, too, began to write again. Not farewell letters, but stories. Pages filled with the quiet heroism of ordinary people, of girls who became mothers by choice, of men who learned that love was not a second chance but a new beginning. And Colt simply loved them. Not with fireworks or grand speeches, but with the steady devotion of a man who knew what it meant to lose everything and dared to hold on anyway. Spring eventually broke through the snow, and with it came color. Meadows burst alive with wildflowers. The river thawed into song, and Emmy's laughter carried farther than the winter winds ever had. She grew taller that year, her braids swinging as she ran through the pasture, chasing the foals with bare feet despite Annabelle's protests. Every season brought its own lessons. Emmy learned to ride under Colt's watchful eye, her small hands gripping the reins with determination. She fell once, hard enough to scrape her knees and knock the wind from her lungs. But before Annabelle could reach her, Colt simply said, "Get up, little one. You're stronger than you think." And Emmy did, teeth clenched, tears drying, pride glowing in her eyes. By the following winter, she was no longer just a child clinging to a doll. She was a girl of the ranch, fearless, curious, and resilient. Annabelle sometimes watched from the porch, her sewing paused in her lap, marveling at how quickly the years were folding into one another. There had been a time she believed she was only a temporary caretaker, a passing shadow in Emmy's story. But each day, with each laugh, each whispered "Mama," Annabelle knew she was rooted here as deeply as the pines along the ridge. Still, the past was not so easily silenced. One summer evening, a rider appeared on the horizon. The sun dipped low, casting him in silhouette, and when he dismounted, Colt's shoulders stiffened. It was a man from Annabelle's former life, someone who had known her in the war, carrying news from a world she had tried to leave behind. Inside the cabin, while Emmy dozed by the fire, Annabelle listened as the messenger spoke of hospitals rebuilt, of comrades who still asked after her, of a surgeon who had once called her the bravest nurse he'd ever seen. The man's words stirred a longing she thought she had buried. A part of her wondered, had she abandoned her calling by staying here? That night, as she sat awake beside Colt, she confessed her fears. What if I was meant for more than this? More than tending a home, more than mending hearts that were never mine to break. Colt took her hand, rough and warm, and shook his head. Annabelle, don't you see? This is not less. You've healed wounds no doctor's hand could touch. You didn't abandon your calling, you brought it here. To Emmy, to me, to this land. Her doubts did not vanish, but his words planted truth in her heart. And when Emmy crawled into her lap the next morning, sleepy-eyed and smiling, Annabelle realized her greatest work was not behind her. It was still unfolding. Years passed. Emmy grew into a young woman with a spirit as fierce as the mountains themselves. She learned to write stories of her own, sitting at Annabelle's desk with ink-stained fingers. She sang while mending fences, hummed as she cooked, and rode with confidence that reminded Colt of his younger self. The ranch became a gathering place for travelers, widows, and lost souls searching for a fresh start. Annabelle opened her doors without hesitation, remembering all too well what it was to arrive at a stranger's doorstep with nothing but fear and hope. And slowly, the Sinclair ranch turned into something greater than a home. It became a refuge. One autumn evening, long after the fields had been harvested, Annabelle stood on the porch, her hair streaked with silver. The air smelled of wood smoke, and the horizon burned with gold. Emmy, nearly grown now, laughed as she rode across the pasture, the sound echoing like music. Colt wrapped an arm around Annabelle's shoulders, steady as ever. "This," Annabelle whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "This is the life I never thought I'd have." Colt kissed her temple. "And it's the life you built, piece by piece, day by day. Don't you forget that." Annabelle smiled, leaning into him as the last of the sun disappeared. For a woman who once believed she was destined only to leave, only to break, she had found a place where love not only remained, it grew. And in that quiet moment, watching Emmy chase the horizon, Annabelle understood. Some stories are not about where they begin, but about where they finally decide to stay. Time moved like a river, steady and unstoppable. Emmy grew into a woman with fire in her spirit and kindness in her hands. She was not just Annabelle's daughter by choice. She was her daughter in every way that mattered. Her letters, her habits, even the way she pressed her lips together when thinking mirrored Annabelle so much that neighbors sometimes forgot they weren't blood. By 18, Emmy could outride most of the ranch hands, her hair flying behind her as she thundered across the range. She carried her father's strength, her mother's courage, and her own fierce determination. Still, she often sat late into the night with Annabelle, asking questions about the past, about her real mother, about the struggles that had shaped them, and about what kind of future a woman like her might find. Annabelle answered honestly. She told her about the pain and the loss, but also about the choice to keep going, to love despite fear, to stand tall even when life seemed determined to break her. And Emmy listened, eyes wide, holding each word like a lantern for her own path. When suitors came riding, Emmy faced them with a steady gaze. Some were kind, some foolish, and some too eager to tame her wild heart. Colt would watch from the porch, arms folded, silent but protective. Annabelle would smile softly, knowing Emmy's choice would never be made out of pressure, only truth. The ranch, by then, had become more than a homestead. Travelers sought it out, widows and drifters found shelter there, and children without homes found safety in Emmy's laughter. The Sinclair place had grown into something almost sacred, a refuge in a world still marked by hardship. Then came the spring when Colt's hair turned fully gray, and his steps slowed just enough for Annabelle to notice. He was still strong, still steady, but time had carved its story into him. Annabelle, too, carried her years with grace. The scar across her ribs was long healed, but the lines around her eyes told of nights spent keeping vigil, of decades lived fully and fiercely. One evening, as the three of them sat together on the porch, watching the stars scatter across the dark sky, Emmy spoke. "Mama, Papa," she said softly, her voice trembling with both excitement and fear. "I've decided. I'm going to stay. This land, this home, it's not just yours anymore. It's mine too. I want to carry it forward." Colt's throat tightened, his hand gripping Annabelle's. Annabelle, eyes shimmering, whispered, "You don't know what that means to me." And so Emmy stayed. She grew into the keeper of the land, the woman who mended fences and baked bread, who welcomed strangers with open arms just as Annabelle once had. In her, the spirit of both parents lived on, the grit, the compassion, the refusal to give in to despair. Years later, when Annabelle's hair was silver and Colt's hands trembled from age, Emmy sat between them, strong and steady. She had children of her own by then, children who called Annabelle Grandma, and listened to Colt's stories with wide-eyed wonder. One night, as the fire crackled low, Emmy's daughter asked, "Mama, why did Grandma and Grandpa never give up, even when it was hard?" Emmy glanced at her parents, at the lines etched deep into their faces, at the love still burning bright between them, and answered, "Because they knew that love is not about never being broken. It's about choosing to put the pieces back together, again and again, until something stronger is built." Annabelle reached for Colt's hand, and he met her with the same fierce devotion he had carried since the day he saved her. And in that warm glow of family gathered close, Annabelle finally understood. The letter she had once written in fear, the one that said she was not enough, had been wrong. She had been more than enough. She had been the heart of it all. And Emmy, her daughter not by blood but by bond, was proof that sometimes the family we build is greater than the family we lose. The Sinclair Ranch stood long after, carrying their legacy forward like the mountains themselves. And when the wind rushed across the valley at sunset, it seemed to whisper their story. A story of survival, of second chances, of a love that refused to be silenced. This wasn't just a story about survival. It was about finding family in the unlikeliest places. It was about love that healed wounds deeper than bullets. It was about the courage to stand, to choose, and to believe that even the most broken hearts can belong somewhere. Subscribe to Legend of Love Stories for more unforgettable romances from the untamed American frontier, where danger walked close, where every decision could change a life, and where love proved stronger than fear. Hit the bell so you never miss a tale where bullets may miss, but hearts never do. Because here, love isn't always gentle, but it is always real. Some families are born of blood, but the strongest ones, the ones that endure storms, scars, and silence, are chosen with courage. And those are the stories we tell.